And welcome back. You're watching Power Lunch South Africa. And in this next discussion, we're reflecting on land reform in South Africa and exploring how partnerships can present a plausible solution to addressing some of the bottlenecks. We're joined by Peter Setou, the CEO at Vumelana Advisory Fund. Peter, so land reform, what exactly hasn't worked when it comes to the implementation in South Africa?
Thank you for having me. Land reform, as we know, is a constitutional imperative in South Africa. There's ample information out there through research as well as reports, some of which have been commissioned by government, which really details some of the challenges that land reform has. And amongst others, it includes the fact that there's a huge demand on the fiscus, which means government alone has not been able to actually fund land reform initiatives. So for me, that's really one of the first key challenges that we are facing. The second challenge is lack of post-settlement support. At a point when land is transferred to beneficiaries of land reform, they don't always have the requisite skills or expertise, including access to markets. So it is, for that matter, crucial that they get post-settlement support so that they can actually address some of those shortcomings. The third thing is some of the asking prices that we've seen related to, the purchase of land that's earmarked for land reform. We've seen instances where some of the amounts are quite exorbitant, and this really makes it difficult for us to get some traction. The other challenges relate to infightings amongst communities themselves, i.e. due to things like lack of governance, transparency, etc. So those are some of the issues that we need to address if we are to make land reform successful in this country.
All right, so I've taken note of funding, post-settlement support, the price of land, as well as fighting amongst community. With funding, like we do know that, as you mentioned, the demand on fiscus has been quite high with the government, looking at the past 2 years that we've had with COVID and ongoing constraints on the economy. So let's maybe hone in on the post-settlement support. Is this an area where the private sector can get involved, and has this already been done, perhaps?
Yeah, post-settlement support is an area that we believe all role players need to play, both government and the private sector, and specifically the private sector. They can play an invaluable role. As Vumelana, we've been involved in this space since 2012, and we've run some programs in support of land reform programs, where we've actually mobilized private investments in order to support the communities. You realize that at a point when people actually lost their land, not only did they lose the land, excuse me, they also lose the skill set and everything. So it is important that you can get the private sector to fill in these gaps. So in a sense, you'll have the community bringing in the land and labor, and the private sector bringing in capital, bringing in the skills, and bringing in access to the markets. So based on our experience since 2012, we've supported in excess of 23 projects, which really put into productive use in excess of 70,000 hectares, and attracting close to, just over 800 million. And we've got a whole host of other programs that we are currently supporting, which once concluded, we stand to raise in excess of 1 billion rand in funding support from the private sector. This is quite significant, and our view is, yes, one might see this as a drop in an ocean, but if we can actually replicate this across the country, I think we'll make a dent to some of the current challenges that we are facing with land reform.
And that really speaks to the element of partnerships amongst the public sector, the private sector, communities, and the investor community. But in terms of enabling such partnerships to happen, what are the bottlenecks for more partnerships of this sort?
I think one of the key challenges in really making these partnerships work is, excuse me, creating an enabling and environment. And I think government has got an invaluable role to play here. Firstly, government should embrace these private partnerships. One, they should create an enabling environment to make sure that all the players can have some comfort that if they invest their money, it is actually safe. Now, when creating or supporting these partnerships, you must realize that you've got two parties who have never really worked with one another. You've got the community who are less sophisticated, who in most instances don't even trust the private sector. On the other hand, you've got the private sector who are also livid of really partnering with the community because they are worried that there might be infightings, etc., which is why it is important that your independent transaction advisors must be brought into the equation so that they can mediate between these two parties to make sure that you can have sustainable agreements which make commercial sense. And this is what we've been doing since 2012, essentially to de-risk that environment for both the communities and the private sector.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that, Peter. That was Peter Setou, CEO at Vumelana Advisory Fund. And that's all for Powerline South Africa today. From